God moved. The Spirit came into activity. In this light came creation of that which in the earth came to be matter. Each soul enters each experience for a lesson, a development. The entity was in the land that has been called the Atlantean, during those periods when there was the breaking up of the land. What we think and what we eat, combined together, make us what we are, physically and mentally. Meditation is listening to the divine within. Dreams are that the entity may gain the more perfect understanding and knowledge of those forces that go to make up the real existence. The earth will be broken up in many places. The early portion will see a change in the physical aspect of the west coast of America. These are the words of a man who is considered the most gifted psychic of our time. He was called a man of miracles, a mystery man, and the sleeping prophet. His work has deeply touched the lives of millions throughout the world. His name was Edgar Cayce. As a young boy on a farm in Hopkinsville, Kentucky, where he was born on March 18, 1877, Edgar Cayce began to exhibit some unusual talents. At the age of 6 or 7, he told his parents that he could see and talk to his grandfather, who was dead. He also told them about his invisible playmates and the glowing energy patterns that he could see around living things. When he was 13, he developed the ability to sleep on his school books after studying the lessons and retain a photographic memory of their entire contents. Then, at 21, his career as a salesman was cut short by an illness that caused a paralysis of his throat muscles, leaving him unable to speak above a low whisper. The local doctors could not find a physical cause for the condition, and all attempts to cure him failed. As a last resort, hypnosis was tried. Although he spoke in a clear voice once hypnotized, he couldn't be awakened from the hypnotic state, nor would he take a post-hypnotic suggestion. When he finally returned to consciousness, he told Al Lane, who was working with him, that he'd felt like this as a child when he learned his lessons by sleeping on his books. Al Lane let Edgar put himself to sleep, and then spoke to him. And Edgar spoke back, giving a detailed diagnosis of his physical condition and suggestions for treatment. These were followed, and Edgar got well. Soon, various doctors in the area were bringing their most difficult cases to Edgar. It was soon discovered that Edgar only needed the names and addresses of patients in order to diagnose their physical conditions. One of the doctors who became very interested was Dr. Wesley Ketchum.
You know that fellow Cayce, you just didn't know where he was going to hit you. That's all. He'd get off the darndest things. Tinkered with him in well cases, bad cases, mediocre, and all kinds. Sure, if I had a case anywhere that I didn't know what it was, or it was different from others, I'd go over him. Edgar, want to go sleep this morning? Yes, sir. All right, lay down. He laid down, went to sleep, and told me what to do. He diagnosed it better than I could or anybody else. Why, some of the things that he did were so uncanny that you could scarcely believe.
Dr. Ketchum wrote a paper about his work with Edgar Cayce for a clinical research society in Boston. This story was picked up by the New York Times. And on October 9th, 1910, they published a full-page article. And soon, newspapers across the country were featuring stories about the farmer boy who became a doctor when asleep. Until 1923, Cayce supported himself as a professional photographer, giving readings only in his spare time. But the requests for readings were becoming so numerous that he was persuaded to employ a full-time secretary. Gladys Davis was hired, and from that point on began in great detail and very carefully to record everything that Edgar Cayce said from the unconscious state.
When I was 18, after I had been working as a stenographer for about 2 years, I went with a friend to take down a reading she was having for her afflicted nephew. I didn't know anything about Edgar Cayce's readings, but I had heard of Edgar Cayce and had met him as a Sunday school teacher. He was active in the First Christian Church in Selma, Alabama, where I lived, and where he had had a studio for about 12 years. I felt an instant attraction to this man. He seemed so, well, I just trusted him, and I didn't think anything about his readings. And when I sat there and listened to it, it was just like any other job of taking dictation, and there are many questions in the readings about whether he meant this or that, about the spelling and so on. One day during a reading, he said a string of words, and I had learned that unless I tried to understand what he was saying and punctuated my notes, it was hard for me to transcribe them later. So I was wondering whether I should put a dash or comma or just how to word this. And over there asleep on the couch, I mean, his eyes closed, he said, "Put a comma between these." and a few times he did that, and other people learned that it was good to be present for the reading, because if they thought of questions, he would answer them without being asked. One of the early readings that was so startling to me, I think it was back in 1925, we were in New York, and this lady was having a reading for her son who was ill. And at the end of this reading, after Mrs. Cayce had given him the suggestion to wake up, he started talking again. He says, "We have here the body of Clara Inlow. We would advise that she have surgery for this condition, a pelvic condition, of a tumor, I think it was." And I didn't know who Clara Inlow was, where she lived, anything. And we got back to Dayton 2 or 3 days later, and there was a letter from this lady saying that the doctors had advised her to have this surgery, and she just wanted his advice first before she'd do it. She hadn't even written the letter, because the letter was dated the next day. But when we got back to Dayton, there it was. So she apparently was just thinking about him and about getting his advice, and the reading came through. One of the things that impressed me so at the beginning, when I went, the first day when I was on the job, he said to me, "Now, Miss Gladys, you're not working for me, you're working with me." And that's how it was all those years. But Edgar Cayce himself, and as a man and his family, I just felt like I belonged with them, and I never left them. All through the years, became one of the family.
Edgar Cayce would not only prescribe treatments for patients, he would occasionally recommend certain doctors for them to go to, although he consciously had no knowledge of these doctors. One of the outstanding personalities of this kind was Harold J. Riley.
I got to know him personally as well as through the readings. He probably has sent me over 1,000 people over the 15 years in his lifetime, which I knew him. But the important fact is that these readings were so erudite, and the more I went into them, the more I realized the basic philosophy of the readings were the things that I myself had learned in the different disciplines that I had studied.
For all healing comes from the one source. And whether there is the application of foods, exercise, medicine, or even the knife, it is to bring to the consciousness of the forces within the body that aid in reproducing themselves, which is the awareness of creative forces, of God forces.
Usually it was a combination of therapies, all of which worked into what I used afterwards as a current word they called CARE, C-A-R-E, and that stands for circulation, assimilation, relaxation, and elimination. And believe me, when you get those things going in the body, the body doesn't have too much chance to become a good culture medium for a germ. And also it will keep the body in condition so you can repel a lot of these so-called, I call them negatives, health negatives, because they give fancy name to sickness and they become expensive that way.
When any food value enters the stomach, it immediately becomes a storehouse or medicine chest that may create all the elements necessary for proper digestion within the system.
I don't think there's anything in any field of healing that can surpass the instructions that Cayce gave, because he didn't give them to cure symptoms. He gave them to cure the basis of the illness. You get a cold. Why? Because you're full of toxins. The basic concepts and the philosophy, you might say, as I gathered from going through thousands of the Cayce readings, is that the basis of health is mental, spiritual, and physical.
We find that these conditions arose as a result of what might be called occupational disturbances. Not enough in the sun, nor enough hard work. There has been plenty of brain work, but the body is supposed to coordinate the spiritual, mental, and physical. He who does not give recreation a place in his life and the proper tone to each phase, well, he just fools himself.
But Cayce, I think, has access to some form of universal knowledge, because some of the things that Cayce recommended we find in the ancient physicians of Rome and Greece, and they had recommended it.
To be sure, attitudes oft influence the physical conditions of the body. No one can hate his neighbor and not have upset digestion or heart disorder. In January 1937, Edgar Cayce received a letter from an 18-year-old girl in Kentucky asking for a physical reading. Her mother recalls the diagnosis by a specialist from Nashville, a diagnosis that was later confirmed by Cayce while asleep.
He called it scleroderma. Well, we'd never heard of scleroderma, and he explained to us that it was a hardening of the tissues of the body. And he said that it would be a very slow, painful death.
After I overheard a conversation that the doctors were talking to my father and mother that I wouldn't get well, I decided to get a reading from Mr. Cayce. The reading was given in January, and the readings were followed to the letter. And I went to the Mayo Clinic in June of 1937, I wrote Mr. Cayce to tell him that I was going. And 7 dermatologists examined me, and I only had enough of the trouble from the hips to the knees for them to even know what I had had. They did not know anything more to do. They had never heard of the treatment, but they said just to continue what I was doing.
The readings prescribed specific diet, inhalants, enemas, sponge baths, castor oil packs, and medicines.
And when we first saw that there were some signs of the hardness leaving her body, well, I felt right then that my prayers had been answered and that Edgar Cayce was really responsible for the help that had started. And I felt like if it had started, that she was going to continue to get better, and she did. It was slow, and some of our friends thought we were crazy, but that didn't make any difference then. I really didn't think too much about Mr. Cayce giving these readings until it came home to us ourselves.
More than 8,000 persons came for help. In those cases where the readings were followed, the patients were cured. Although Cayce's advice was unique for each individual, there are many doctors who are studying and working with his medical prescriptions and finding them applicable today. 2 such doctors are William and Gladys McGarry.
We've had lots of interesting experiences with patients that have come to us because of the Edgar Cayce material, and we've done research with a variety of different conditions such as arthritis and scleroderma. One of the most interesting cases, I think, was a scleroderma case that presented itself to us back in 1968, really, before the clinic really got started. She was treated according to the concepts in the Cayce readings dealing with scleroderma. We adapted these ideas to the treatment of scleroderma in her case and used the things such as the wet cell battery and massage and manipulation and diet and ways of thinking about things that are inherent in the Cayce material. Within a period of several months, she was able to swallow normally again, and her hands had changed, and she had improved so much we presented her to the medical symposium.
The philosophy that we work with at the ARE clinic is based primarily on the material that comes from the Edgar Cayce readings. And basic thrust of it is bringing together the whole person. We feel like the important thing in working with a person is not working with the disease the person has, but working with the person themselves. We call this holistic medicine. It deals with the body, mind, and spirit. One of the quotes from the readings is that the spirit is the life, the mind is the builder, and the physical is the result. With this as the undergirding for our work, we try to approach the patients that come into the clinic as not just people with a problem, but people who are looking at life as a whole thing, where they are approaching each one of their illnesses or their difficulties as opportunities. And this makes it then an adventure in consciousness. So we think that when a person has a specific illness, if he can look at it as an adventure in consciousness, then he's dealing with something that can be handled and not a miserable situation that makes life a burden.
The flash burns were so severe that the doctors felt that the eyes could not be saved without taking one of them out. Our family physician told me this, and it was then that I asked Edgar Cayce, my father, to give a reading. When the treatments he recommended were applied, in applications on the eyes, internal medicine, and a change of diet, the eyes began to heal. And in a matter of weeks, they removed the bandages, and I could see. My father was an unusually creative person. He was a fine photographer and was noted for his pictures, especially those of children. Edgar Cayce was an inventor of games. He loved to play all kinds of games and invented one called Pit, which is still on the market. He was a fine bowler. I never won a bowling game from him. He was a lousy golfer, but he loved to play games. He was a great fisherman and fished everywhere that he had an opportunity, in a pond or in the ocean. He was a man who loved to cook and did all kinds of things with preserves and berries of various kinds. He had the finest asparagus beds in Virginia Beach and the earliest strawberries and the largest. He was a great gardener and loved to have exotic trees of all kinds around him. He was a man who was a fine Sunday school teacher, the best I think I ever knew, and he always had the largest classes in any church that he worked in. He also had Sunday school classes in prisons, wherever he happened to be. This was quite a remarkably creative man, though he never had any formal education. During Edgar Cayce's lifetime, and particularly in the closing years of his life, he was able apparently to see energy patterns around people and could, at a conscious level, read these in terms of color. He could, for example, describe an emotion. He wouldn't talk to a person if they'd been angry within the past 2 or 3 hours, and pull this on several people. I have watched him go around a group of 30 or 40 people and pick up both physical, emotional, and mental patterns, as he said, from the aura, from the color around them.
As I came to Virginia Beach then to meet this man, I must confess I was a bit disappointed. I expected to see somebody that looked very unusual, statuesque, and with perhaps a shining countenance and very handsome, you know. But he looked like a country doctor, a simple person. You wouldn't turn around the street if you saw him. But once you spoke to him, his voice was soft, it was direct, it was honest, it was embracing. And for me, I always saw a double pupil, a superimposure, as if he were looking through eternity. It made you a little uncomfortable at times because you wondered what you had done yesterday or said yesterday that you ought not to have said. And yet after you got to know him, you knew that he wasn't anyone who ever condemned. If he ever told you anything about a negative side of your nature, he would do it in such a way that you considered it a blessing. Now, you know, not even your husband or wife could do that.
I recall that my first impression was of this very tall man, a very fine-looking tall man, very self-contained. Some of the things that I recall that I find even now very interesting was his acceptance of anyone who came in to see him. He really loved people, and you had a feeling of really being welcome in the home of Edgar Cayce. I came to know that he was a very knowledgeable person in many fields, and that this was something that he did not get from books. The only thing I ever saw him read was his Bible in the newspaper in the years that I was in the home, and I was frequently there. It was an interesting experience to be in this home with Edgar Cayce and Mrs. Cayce. She is seldom mentioned, and she was so much a part of this whole scene. Her lovely, quiet manner, her strength. She had fantastic strength. She handled things quietly, but you knew she was in command. She followed the readings where diet was concerned for her family. She was a marvelous balance for Edgar Cayce, who was so given to going to extremes, such as making just jars and jars of preserves and plant many, many rose bushes, you know, and order many loads of dirt, which he really didn't need. And then the silence. He would go into periods of being very quiet.
In the early 30s, I was with him in New York at a time when he was giving a reading, a psychic reading on someone who was in the room, and there were about 40 or 50 people present. And he was lying on a studio couch in the center of the room with people sitting all around him. There was no head or foot to the studio couch. And as in the middle of the reading he was talking, a man, the doctor who was there, wrote a question on a piece of paper, got up and passed it to me across Edgar Cayce's body. Now, the moment the paper went over his body, he stopped talking. And for the next 20 or 30 minutes, I was trying to get him to go on. And then for another 20 or 30 minutes, I was trying to get him to wake up. And he wouldn't do either. He had just stopped instantaneously. Finally, as I repeated the suggestion that the body would be normalized, the circulation would be equalized, and he would wake up feeling good, relaxed, and so forth, he suddenly began to react in a very strange way in front of all these people. With his hands crossed across his solar plexus, he came to a standing position at the end of the couch, as if somebody had put their hand back of his head and set him up straight. He was dizzy, he was awake, and he had to get out of the room very quickly. He was upset. Now, he had a glass of milk and a cracker and came back in. He felt fine, it was all right. But we then asked questions. What went on? What happened? And it was then that he told us, for the first time, that there was a real physical body, a finer physical body, lying parallel to his flesh body, that it was his, and that he had moved out, and this was kind of like I've described it frequently as a space platform from which he could then take off with greater ease, the mental attunement for the telepathy or the clairvoyance in which he was giving the readings. But apparently he went out every time. He got out of his body, so to speak, this finer body got out. And so we ask a lot of questions about this, and his answers would lead us to believe that this is a body that is moving at a much faster vibratory rate, that it interpenetrates the flesh body constantly, that in sleep it frequently moves out, and we have what are out-of-body experiences, which are being widely reported and even recorded with brainwave patterns accompanying them now in laboratories in various parts of the country. Now, he would indicate also that this is the body that we use of the moment of death. But there's atomic in structure, and that it would actually carry with it certain mental, emotional, and physical patterns of suffering and so forth. To some extent, it may be the basis for telepathy and clairvoyance. In some kinds of clairvoyance and telepathy, there may be an actual out-of-body projection. Edgar Cayce, for example, in giving readings for people, hundreds and hundreds of times would describe things that he smelled, that he saw, that he heard, that were going on around the person for whom he was about to give information. For example, I can't start this reading until this person gets through arguing with her sister. He was in Virginia Beach and the woman was in Boston. In New York, for example, on one occasion, he had made an appointment for a reading. The man had set it for his apartment. He lay down here in Virginia Beach, was given the address of the man in New York, and he said, he isn't here. He's on his way. There's been an automobile accident with a bus. The taxi cab has run into a bus. He said, he's praying. He said, I'll wait for him. And so he lay there for about 12 minutes. Then he said, he's come in now, and he began the reading. Now, I went up to the telephone at that point, got up and left the room, went to the telephone, called this man in New York at his apartment. He said, am I going to get my reading? Am I going to get my reading? I've been delayed. He told me the whole thing. I was in a taxi cab, had an accident in the bus, ran into a taxi cab that I was on coming across town. I was delayed. I've just gotten here. I said, yeah, you're going to get your reading. Okay.
In 1923, Arthur Lammers, a printer from Ohio, requested a different kind of reading from Cayce. He asked for an astrological chart. The sleeping Cayce gave a horoscope in brief, and then, near the end of the reading, came the curious sentence, he was once a monk. As always, when Cayce awoke, he recalled nothing of what he had said while in trance. Being a devout Christian, this reference to reincarnation was disturbing to him. He searched the Bible and came to accept reincarnation as an aid to personal growth. That reading opened up a whole new area of exploration for Edgar Cayce and resulted in 2,500 life readings dealing with reincarnation, which have become the source of a great deal of study. In 1945, Dr. Gina Cerminara, a psychologist, began an extensive study of the life readings.
I had several objectives in mind. I wanted, of course, first of all, to establish what evidence there was here for reincarnation. And second, I wanted to integrate the information here on reincarnation with modern psychology. And third, I wanted to integrate it with religion, and especially Christianity. And fourth, I wanted to formulate some tentative laws, at least, of karma, or how reincarnation operated. And then besides that, I had in mind to try to explain why do human beings suffer.
For each soul, each entity constantly meets self. And if each soul would but understand those hardships which are accredited much to others are caused most by self, know that in those you are meeting thyself.
It does place this information in a philosophical and a spiritual frame of reference, and it therefore gives people a sense of real meaning and purpose in life. And this, I think, is extremely important for mankind.
Know that it is not all just to live, not all just to be good, but good for something, that ye may fulfill that purpose for which ye have entered this experience. And that purpose is that you might know yourself, to be yourself, and yet one with the creative forces, or God.
And while I am frequently very dubious that Western civilization can survive, I also do think that if Western man can grasp the reincarnation idea and begin to practice it in his life, he can transform himself and in turn transform society. You remember in the Bible, Jesus said, "Be ye therefore perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect." And it would be difficult, not to say impossible, for us to become perfect in one lifetime. Whereas with the reincarnation concept, we are given another chance, in fact more than one chance, to perfect ourselves. And the ultimate aim of this is, as Cayce put it in what I think is a very good phrase, to become companions and co-creators with God.
Then, as there has been and is the passage of a soul through time and space, through this and that experience, it has been and is for the purpose of giving more and more opportunities to express that which justifies man in his relationships one with another, in mercy, love, patience, long-suffering, brotherly love. A psychotherapist who knew Cayce then, Dr. Harmon Brough.
When I was a young graduate student at the University of Chicago Divinity School, I heard about Cayce and went and spent a good part of a year listening to his readings, hundreds of them, and making notes which later I put into my doctoral thesis about him at the University of Chicago and used in my graduate study at Harvard, too. We talked about reincarnation, of course, and began to develop a picture that, to me, made a model of a life journey which avoided the pitfalls that are often associated with the concept of reincarnation. It avoided fatalism. It avoided a kind of self-centered perfectionism of soul development, and avoided that detachment from other people and their karma that sometimes has marked the misuse of reincarnation. Instead, this was a view of responding to the divine initiative, reaching out to the individual to help the person to develop talents and interests and values that would make a possibility for creative service of other people. And that was the biblical core that Edgar Cayce responded to, and built a picture of people working in covenants and growing together in the life of faith that also answered to the biblical account that Edgar Cayce cared about and understood, with the result that people in Christian and Jewish life both have looked thoughtfully at this and not wanted to be caught turning away from it as unscientific, as has happened in the church's life when it is said that Galileo was wrong or Darwin or Freud, rather saying, if this is true, then let's grapple with it and see how we can keep it within the perspectives of a rich life of faith.
Keep in the mental attitude of being constructive in thought. Not any animosity, nor any feeling sorry for self or because others are different and better in any respect, enjoying things that should be thine own. For whatever state ye find thyself, that use to the glory of the creative force.
Well, I think that the question that was asked or presented to Mr. Cayce more often than any other was, Mr. Cayce, you're so wonderful. How do you do all of this? And his answer always was, you can do this too if you are willing to pay the price. And he said all of us have the same source. We all are an externalization of the God, the creative force, which makes it possible for all of us to do all of the things that any human being ever did in the earth, including our guide, Jesus the Christ. And so he said that within all of us there are also buried not only the talents, the experiences, the memories that we've had from the beginning of time, but that divine self which is just waiting for us to be awakened. And he said that perhaps the last remaining door for all of us that remains available, even in our present state, is the dream's state. Because it is through the dream state, especially after meditation, that we open up the doors of consciousness, of all the levels of our own consciousness, to all time and space. And in this time and space lie, of course, the secrets of the universe, our own experiences, those talents which we have achieved, which we may pick up and bring to the surface when we begin to use them aright.
The dreams as we see that come to the entity are those correlations of the physical with the subconscious forces of the body. And from same there may be gained those truths, those lessons, which, when used aright, may be for the development of the body spiritually, mentally, financially.
And so he said meditation was that which every single soul had to do. Prayer is talking to God, but meditation is listening so that the divine within may begin to speak to us personally. And in my own experience, I have worked at meditation for 30 years, and I have found nothing that is of greater help than meditation, because it does keep you awake to your own faults. It keeps that creative force flowing. You find that you have a great deal more energy, and of course as we study we know that this creative force is energy in essence, that you will always have enough energy to do the vital important things, but that balance always has to be achieved.
The startling thing to every soul is to awaken to the realization that it is indeed a child of God. Edgar Cayce's second son, Edgar Evans, became interested in one of the most controversial areas of the life readings.
For a number of years, I had listened to my father, Edgar Cayce, give readings, and a number of these were physical readings, but a lot of them are life readings, and these are the ones that interested me particularly, or these vocational guidance readings that dealt with a person's past life and the influence that it had on his present life. And a lot of these readings mentioned Atlantis. At that time, Atlantis was a myth. It wasn't seriously accepted in scientific circles. Plato mentioned it, and he described it as a continent between Africa and South America that sank in a volcanic catastrophe about 10,000 BC. Well, nobody thought any kind of a civilization could exist at that time. And when Edgar Cayce began mentioning this continent again, well, I decided to do a little research. And it mentioned Atlantis going way back into prehistory, even when man first came into the earth. Now, of course, Edgar Cayce spoke of a very high civilization. He mentioned aircraft and TV and things that sound like masers and lasers and nuclear power. And all this was extremely fantastic and unbelievable.
Those were the periods in which there was the application of much that is being discovered or rediscovered today, in the application of power to modes of transit, as well as the use of nature's means for a helpful force in giving greater crops for individual consumption. The periods when a great deal of thought was given as to conveniences of every nature.
And the story that came out of it was really worse than Plato, because it mentioned not one destruction, but three. One of these destructions about 50,000 BC, another one about 28, and the last one about 10,000 BC, which I think is the one that Plato referred to. I think the significance of this, though, that what Edgar Cayce said, that many people who lived in Atlantis were reincarnating now. These people were advanced technically, and that all this technical civilization was easy for them, and that the Atlanteans brought destruction on themselves by the misuse or the selfish misuse of their power, and that the same thing is possible today.
Tendencies in the heart and souls of men are such that these upheavals may be brought about. It is true that man brings order out of chaos by his compliance with divine law. By his disregard of it, man brings chaos and destructive forces into his experience.
This could possibly happen again. I hope it won't. I don't think the future's fixed. I think maybe we have a choice as individuals and probably as a nation.
One of Edgar Cayce's lifelong dreams was to build a hospital and to form an organization that would preserve and work with his psychic data. A reading was given and stated, "As has been given, the better place to establish such an institute would be near large bodies of water, preferably on the East Coast, at or near Virginia Beach, Virginia." In the mid-20s, the Cayce family moved to Virginia Beach. The Association of National Investigators was formed in 1927, and it was that organization that built the hospital. His dream was short-lived, for the hospital was lost during the Depression. In 1931, the Association for Research and Enlightenment was formed. It undertook to cross-index and build experiments on the more than 14,000 readings that Cayce gave in his lifetime. The purpose of this ever-growing organization is perhaps best expressed in the words taken from a letter from Edgar Cayce to a friend.
All men must find within self that which rings true for them. Neither I nor the association that carries on the work with the readings has anything to sell or any instant answers. What we do have is a body of information. Of this information, I can only say that in my life and in the lives of many of those who have come in contact with the readings, there seems to be much that is a help. But if you would know, you must seek, for it is a personal experience. You must judge for yourself. Facts and results are the only measuring rods. If this knowledge is to be of any lasting benefit to mankind, It will require open-minded, intelligent research by men and women in all walks of life engaged in a cooperative effort. Our association hopes in some measure to bring about such cooperation. To this end, we invite all who are interested to work with us in further study and research. There are no barriers to prevent any individual from taking part in the association.
Those who carry on with the work share the ideal set by Edgar Cayce, which appears over the entrance of the library, that we may make manifest the love of God and man.
And so Edgar Cayce have shortened his life because of the inability to say no to the suffering people who came to his door. And though he had been warned, you remember, to give only 2 readings a day, he was giving 8, 10, and 12, and it was just too hard for the physical body. And so he succumbed to what? An over love for his fellow man? I don't know. It's difficult for us to judge this. You know, the important thing about the depth of this man, Edgar Cayce, was that as I read my life reading every year, I find new things in there that I didn't see before.
I think the greatest thing that has happened to me is the knowledge I've gained of the Bible and the true meaning of the Bible according to the Edgar Cayce readings. And it's given me an understanding of why we are here, where we came from, and where we're going. And the knowledge that God is mindful of us, that we have belonged to God, we're going back to God, and that He is mindful of us here and now. And that we can communicate, that we each have a pipeline to God. We don't have to go running to this one and that one and the other one to find out what is right for us. He can tell us.
So when they took the bandages off of my eyes about 3 months later, and I could see, I began to think of Edgar Cayce quite differently, not only as a father, but as someone who had saved my eyesight. Now, we go on with this today, while hundreds of doctors are beginning to work with and experiment and test data from the Edgar Cayce readings on physical conditions, and thousands of people are getting help from this information where only a few could reach it before.
I had known Mr. Cayce for many, many years. He was always such a fine Christian young man. I really didn't think too much about Mr. Cayce giving these readings until it came home to us ourselves. I've heard his mother say that Edgar never took any credit for this. He always felt like God gave him this gift to heal people. And, well, we just all loved him.
You know, you'd like to live 1,000 years so you could keep working with the Cayce readings and finding out more of the things that unfold.
No way you can even score when someone is willing to lay down their life for you again and again and again and again. But that's what he did each time he gave a reading.
Is the inhaling of smoke harmful for this body? More harmful than would be for some other body. Not to excess, but as the activity is as this. Nicotine, as indicated from those of tobacco upon the system, in most activities is an stimuli. Any stimuli to excess is harmful, but an stimuli that makes for the circulation in any portion of the body may clarify, as it were, the cobwebs or cloud forms, the circulatory activity to the brain, which is reached by the circulation through the secondary cardiac forces, as indicated disturbances are. Hence, moderation. Moderation would mean for this body anywhere from 3 to 6 to 8 smokes a day. Above this will be excessive.